I'm James Byrne with MNP, and we are excited to be back as a platinum sponsor of this year's summit. I want to start by saying thank you to the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance for their foresight to create this important annual forum. While the virtual format of this year's summit is different, the focus remains grounded on the importance of collaboration and working together to find solutions. 6 years ago, VIEA had the vision to create an economic report card for the island to provide data-driven insights into what's happening in our regional economy. Today, it's never been more important to have relevant, local, and timely data so we can create a roadmap to chart our collective path forward. MNP is proud to work with VIEA to bring this report to life each year. Our consultant on this project is our Senior Economist, Susan Mowbray, who has developed an in-depth knowledge of the island economy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Susan to share the highlights of the 2020 State of the Island Economic Report.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this final keynote presentation of this year's 2020 The State of the Island Economic Summit. My name is Joe Perkins from Check News, and I'm happy to be back facilitating this final presentation for you this year. This is the 6th year that this summit has provided an island economic report, and this year with so many questions and so many hurdles facing all economies in the world, I think it's safe to say that this kind of report is needed now more than ever. Over the next hour, we will hear from our guest. I will ask a few questions. I'm planning to let our guest do most of the talking. Our speaker today is a partner and senior economist with MNP. MNP is a leading national accounting, tax, and business consulting firm here in Canada. She leads the economics and research division of MNP and has more than 20 years experience in economics, modeling, and analysis. So she's perfectly positioned to comment on the state of the island's economy. It also happens to be her birthday today. She's back with us. She's given us the last 6 island economic reports, and we are so happy to have her back today, Susan Mowbray. Susan, happy birthday and welcome back to the summit.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here as always. This year, like everything else, we're in a bit of a different environment. And the COVID edition of the State of the Island report is a little bit different.
Before we get to your presentation, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, this has been such a different year. And like I said in the opening remarks there, you've done this this is your 6th year doing this. Was it different this time around? Did you know going in that this was going to be a bit of a different challenge since we are in the middle of a pandemic?
Yeah, when we started planning the report, it was at the start of the pandemic. Things were just unfolding, and we knew at that time that it was going to be a very different report in some ways. We've tried to maintain the flavor and sort of the content of the report, but we've added a bunch additional information, and we've been fortunate to have the participation of several of BC's leading private sector economists who've provided a Q&A on some of the bigger picture questions to see what their view of where things are going to unfold is.
All right, I'll let you do, like I said, most of the talking here. Once the presentation's done, I'll ask some questions and we'll go from there. But I believe you're starting with a bit of a history lesson. We're going back in time a bit.
Yeah, I thought it would be good to start with a brief discussion of economic history to provide some context to help sort of understand where we are and the current recession that we're in. So I'm just gonna, because it's the State of the Island report, and we always do this, we're going to share some slides. But really, recessions are part of the business cycle, and they typically occur when you have some sort of event or structural problem with the economy that leads to a decline in economic activity. Now, the 2 most recent or severe recessions in Canada since the global financial crisis were in 1981 and then in 2008. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the 1981 recession. And what happened here was that we had a series of oil price shocks that led to price increases. And we were starting to see increases in unemployment. So government stepped in and tried to prevent a recession by engaging in some stimulus spending. Because the price shocks were raising the cost of production and leading to lower unemployment, we ended up with a combination of rising prices and declining employment, and the stimulus actually added further inflationary pressure. And so we started to see, rapid increases in prices. This led governments to try to tame their inflationary pressures by raising interest rates, which plunged the economy into a severe recession. GDP declined by about 6% over an 18-month period. So, and then it took another 12 to 24 months to recover to pre-recession levels. So in this case, it was a very prolonged recession. It was actually the longest recession in Canadian history since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And a large part of the cause of this one was that government intervention. The length of that was probably the government intervention that happened. In 2008, it was a different situation. What happened was we had the collapse of the US housing market that exposed problems in the financial markets, and this led to the financial crisis. In Canada, this recession was a little bit shorter. It was more typical of a recession, it was about 7 months, and resulted in a 2.6% drop in GDP here in BC. Recovery was actually relatively quick. GDP and employment returned to pre-recession levels by 2010. Here in BC, the impact was acutely felt within our forest industry, which at the time was operating at increased capacity in an attempt to salvage as much of the value from our forests in the interior, which had been ravaged by the mountain pine beetle. Our primary market for softwood lumber is the U.S. So when U.S. housing collapsed and the U.S. housing construction collapsed, what we saw was devastating for our forest industry. Wood product manufacturing declined by about 35 or 31%. Harvesting activity declined closer to 40. And it wasn't really until 2012 that activity started to come back up when we started to ship more wood to China. Here on Vancouver Island, the impacts of the financial crisis were felt in the forest industry and the tourism sectors. One of the things that happened along with the financial crisis was we had an appreciation of the Canadian dollar that meant that Canadians started to travel abroad more because it was relatively cheaper. And you combine that with the recession in the US that was leading to declining incomes there, which meant fewer visitors were coming from the US. So it was not a good period for tourism either. And generally between 2010 and 2014, growth was relatively modest. And then around 2014, we started to see migration pick up. And part of this was because of what was happening in the oil patch. People started to leave Alberta and come back to BC. And then we were also seeing similar migration from Ontario. And so that boost in population helped to start a cycle of growth here on Vancouver Island. And then there was the other thing where we saw the value of the Canadian dollar start to decline, which gave a boost to our tourism industry. So things were pretty, moved along pretty well between 2015 and 2019. But last year, when we gave the State of the Island report, one of the key messages was that we were expecting things to start to slow, but we weren't expecting them to stall. Some of the key factors on that were that there was a tight labor market that was making it very difficult for businesses to attract and retain workers. We had slowing population growth, and there was a contraction in the forest industry. Last fall we were just sort of a third of the way through a serious strike in the forest industry that was having on Vancouver Island, that was having some severe repercussions throughout the supply chain. So Q1, we were starting to see things were starting to evolve as we expected, and then COVID hit. So rather than having sort of slow growth of around 2% in 2020, now we have an expectation that GDP is actually going to decline by between 2 and 8% in 2020, which is kind of getting into that level that we saw back in 1981, where we saw that long, prolonged recession. And so that kind of a decline in GDP is going to push us back to similar levels of where we were in about 2016 and 2017. So it's really the expectation is that we're erasing all the growth we've seen in the last 3 to 4 years. The outlook is a little better for 2021. We're expecting that growth to pick up again, to be in the 2 to 5% range as things recover. And while that sounds really good, it's very important to understand that 2 to 5% is on a much lower level. So it's, even if we do hit 5%, it only gets us back partway to where we were in 2019, and definitely is behind where we would have expected to be in 2020. And since COVID is not a typical crisis event, the recovery from it's not going to be typical either. We were looking at an economy that was structurally sound, and and that while growth was slowing, the outlook remained positive. Then we were hit with restrictions that shut down large parts of the service sector, and they reduced travel. Many businesses were forced to alter their operations by transitioning their employees to working remotely, and many other ones actually had to shut down. So businesses, and those were those businesses that couldn't comply with physical distancing requirements, such as barbers, hair salons, and other personal services. For restaurants and bars, they could only offer takeout services for a while. And then along with that, we had the closure of the border to all non-essential travel, and for a period, elective surgeries were postponed. So this is not like anything we've ever experienced before. And the standard tools that we would use to aid recovery won't necessarily work. So in 2008, what we did was, it was the construction and manufacturing industries that were the hardest hit. So we spent money on building infrastructure to get people back to work. In the current situation, it's hospitality, recreation, and the entertainment sector that have been hardest hit. And the restrictions are still affecting their ability to operate. So helping those businesses and their employees is not quite as straightforward as investing in building projects. We're also dealing with a situation in which the data that we normally rely on isn't necessarily that informative in real time. And there are a lot of other little nuances to consider. So things have moved really quickly. And so most of the economic indicators we track are published with a lag. So they tell us what happened at a previous point in time and give some idea of where things are heading. But things are only heading in the direction based on the existing circumstances. So when things are changing week to week with restrictions, it can make the picture a little bit cloudy, because what you thought the influences were may have changed by the time you get to the next point. So the main data source that we have been relying on as things have been unfolded is the labor force survey, which is conducted monthly. So if we look at employment trends on Vancouver Island, we kind of can see how this is unfolded. So at the start of 2019, employment was a bit lower at the start of 2020, employment was a little bit lower than in 2019, as expected. This is part of that was the strike, the effect of the strike, and part of that was just a general slowing of the economy. And that strike had been resolved by March when BC declared a state of emergency and went into lockdown. But it had just been resolved, so we weren't seeing any uptick in employment related to forestry. So between February, the last point before the lockdown, last full month before the lockdown, and May, when restrictions started to be lifted, we lost about 28,000 jobs on Vancouver Island, which is a lot. And then as things started to reopen in May, employment levels started to rise. And by September, employment was actually higher than February, but was only about 2% below what it was in 2019, which doesn't sound as bad as you might think, given everything we've heard. However, when you look at what happens by sector, it becomes clear that this short, steep downturn is not a universal thing. And these slides show us what's happening in the goods sector versus what's happening in the service sector. So in the goods sector, what we saw is that the first quarter employment was relatively flat year over year. And then between March and June, what happened was employment declined. And that was that period of restriction. But it started to improve once things opened up. And by September, employment in the forestry, agriculture, manufacturing, and utility sectors is actually up year over year. Construction, on the other hand, is down. It fell between March and June, and it is lower year over year as of September. With that, it's really important to understand that there was declines in the level of construction employment between March and June, but since June, the level has been relatively stable. What hasn't happened is we haven't seen a big increase in construction, which we normally would during the summer season. So we haven't seen a big increase in employment activity. When we look at the service sector, we actually start to see where the downturn has really impacted things significantly. In the hospitality, recreation, and those culture and entertainment industries, which is where a lot of our tourism businesses would be found, employment declined by 40% during the initial phases of the lockdown. And it's only recovered to be 20% down by September. So that's still a very significant decline in employment in those sectors. And for those businesses, there hasn't really been a recovery yet. They're still struggling to get by. In the remainder of the service sector, however, after there was an initial decline, things like with a lot of the good sector, things improved, and we're actually seeing employment be up year over year. And so that would include things like tech. It would include things like health and all those other services that we think about. Another really interesting point that we're seeing in the data is what's happening with the unemployment rate. So this graph compares the unemployment rate on Vancouver Island with the Lower Mainland and unemployment in BC overall. So in 2019, Vancouver Island had one of the lowest unemployment rates in BC. And then at the start of the year, in that Q1, we actually saw the unemployment rate rise, and it was a bit above where the rest of the province. And that is partly a reflection of the strike that I was talking about. Then we had the lockdown, and by June, the unemployment rate had doubled from 6% to 12% on Vancouver Island. But here again, we started to see that it was now below BC, the average in BC, and it was below the Lower Mainland. And as of September, the unemployment rate sitting about 9%, which is higher than it was during the financial crisis of 2008 on Vancouver Island. But it's still a full percentage point below the unemployment rate in the Lower Mainland. And so typically, and that's a little bit unusual. So typically in a downturn, the Lower Mainland tends to fare better than other regions because of the diversity of the economy there. But in this case, because of the sectors that are impacted, it's the Lower Mainland that is relatively harder hit than the rest of the province. And the story that I've just told about what's happened on Vancouver Island being having recovered a lot of the jobs that were lost in a lot of sectors, that's the same story you see in a lot of places outside the Lower Mainland. It's just in the Lower Mainland because of the concentration of those sectors that have been hardest hit that we're seeing higher rates of unemployment and that there. Bankruptcy is also another little bit of a puzzle. Bankruptcy data usually provides a sense of the level of financial stress on businesses and households. And so in 2019, business bankruptcies were higher than average of the previous 3 years. And that was sort of consistent with that weakening that we had expected. Yet between January and June of this year, business bankruptcies are down year over year. And if you look, you see similar trends within consumer bankruptcies in the first 6 months, which is not at all what we would expect given current economic conditions. But there's a couple things to consider with this. First is that there's been significant levels of government supports provided to businesses and individuals to support incomes and to help businesses cover their costs. And this could have prevented some bankruptcy filings. The other thing to consider when it comes to businesses is that businesses only file for bankruptcy when they run into financial distress and there's assets that need to be distributed. It's possible that many businesses either just close to avoid running into financial difficulties, or that those businesses did not have assets to distribute. And in that case, that might mean that there was personal guarantees that were provided by individuals, and that could have an impact on future personal filings. So what we're seeing right now is as the government is starting to pull back on these support programs, there is an expectation that bankruptcy filings, both for businesses and consumers, will increase. But at this point, we don't have a good sense of how many businesses have closed as a result of the pandemic. And it's still going to be a little while before we actually do. Some of the surveys that have been done by some of the chambers and that have indicated that somewhere between 20 and 30% of small businesses don't expect to survive the recession. But we won't be able to know. We won't have a good sense of how many actually, how close that figure actually is until we start to get some of the business count data that's going to come out from Stats Canada. It usually comes out about twice a year. The next scheduled one would be sometime in Q1 to see what's happened as of December of 2019. So now that I've talked a little bit about sort of the background, if you look at what's happening to some of the key influences on growth on Vancouver Island, I thought I'd start with the areas where there's some potential optimism, because there is some potential optimism here. And the first one is population growth. Now, population growth has been an important contributor to Vancouver Island's economic growth story. And in 2019, growth continued sort of at rates consistent with BC as a whole and with the Lower Mainland. It was a little higher than outside of than other places outside the Lower Mainland. And most of the people that are moving to Vancouver Island are from other parts of BC or other parts of Canada. International migration is typically not a large component of growth on Vancouver Island, and most international immigrants that do move to Vancouver Island end up settling in Victoria. But with the travel restrictions, international immigration has been dramatically reduced. There's been delays in processing applications, and there's been delays because the in-person interviews that typically happen cannot take place. So we're seeing significant declines in international migration. But for Vancouver Island, because it's not that dependent on international migration for population growth, that has less of an effect. We're still seeing, there's a lot of indications that people are still moving within BC, and that there's still people moving to Vancouver Island. There's been speculation about what may be behind this. One of the factors that's been put forward is that the shift to remote working is encouraging people to relocate for lifestyle reasons. However, that's a relatively, I would argue that it's probably too soon to tell whether that's a true trend or whether that's just one or two pockets here and there. And if it is a trend, whether it's a long-term trend or not. It may also be a continuation of migration by retirees and those seeking more affordable housing out of the Lower Mainland. We don't know yet. The data's too spotty, and it's a little bit too early to tell. Regardless of what the cause is, it suggests that Vancouver Island is going to continue to benefit from people moving to there. So population growth will still be an important part of the story, and that's going to be good for the construction industry and the housing market. If we look at aquaculture, the outlook is a little less optimistic. While production has remained stable, but we did see exports fall significantly in the first 6 months of the year. They were down about 11%. This was a result of a number of factors, including there was reductions in flight capacity to key markets that impacted the ability of producers to get their product to market. And there was also a significant drop in demand from restaurants and other commercial operators because of the restrictions. That led to declines in prices, so it was putting some pressure on the bottom line for the aquaculture producers. So at the same time that prices were falling, we also saw costs starting to increase because of increased safety protocols to comply with physical distancing requirements and increased freight rates. So for aquaculture operators, 2020 is expected to be a pretty tough year. And then you're going to add to that the uncertainty with respect to 10 years when new rules come into effect in June 2022. That's only about 18 months away. So we're not expecting to see much growth in this area in the near term, and we actually could see contraction. Similarly, the outlook for forestry also remains muted. Production continued to decline in 2019. And that was partly due to that prolonged strike that I've been talking about. And it also, the strike was at the Western Forest Product Mills, and that meant that harvesting activity also stalled, and that had a lot of knock-on effects across the industry. Shipments of logs, if we look at shipments, we see that shipments of logs were down only slightly, while we saw manufactured product drop by about 17% year over year in 2019. And so that strike that I was talking about got resolved in early March, but then COVID hit, so it took a little while to resume operations for the forestry on Vancouver Island even after the restrictions were lifted. This was what was happening, and sort of that slowdown in operations and taking time to restart was something that was happening, in the forest industry across North America. And so what we were seeing over the summer was we saw this big surge in prices because people were doing a lot more home renovations, and there was construction started up again. So there was a real shortage of supply that was pushing up prices. Now, those price increases are expected to be, for the most part, temporary as supply catches up. And we've actually already started to see the prices coming down. But the expectation right now in the industry, given the level of activity we're seeing in construction and continued home renovation demand, is that prices will come down, but they're not going to be as low as they were in 2018, 2019, and they're probably going to be at a more sustainable level. But despite the improvements in price, timber supply still is a big issue on Vancouver Island, and we still haven't resolved the softwood lumber dispute with the U.S. So overall, things in the forest industry are still looking very, very low growth. Moving on to international education. Here too, what was expected in 2019 did unravel. We did see sort of a slowing of growth. Where there was modest growth, but it was slower than it had been. Going forward, there's even more uncertainty in this space. For international students, travel restrictions and the virtual delivery of classes have significantly reduced the number of international students physically present in BC. This has a number of implications for the communities that host international students. The first one is on the demand for accommodations. If there's going to we've seen declines in the demand for student accommodations, which frees up rentals, so that could reduce pressure on rent prices. On the other side, businesses that cater to international students are going to see declines and may not survive this. There's also a question of how declines in international students are going to affect post-secondary budgets. Right now, not only the post-secondary institutions are struggling with the increased costs of delivering virtual classes, but they're also seeing significant declines in conference revenue because the conferences that had been planned are not happening. So going forward, it's not clear that international students who pay a differential fee are going to see the same value in online delivery that they do with in-person. And so we may see a decline in the number of international students choosing to enroll in a BC school, or universities may be forced to reduce fees for international students. So there's a lot of question marks there. And that brings us to tourism, which has been absolutely devastated. I was in Victoria in August, and I took these pictures. It was around noon on a Thursday on Government Street. And I thought they really summed up how tourism and the hospitality in general have been affected by the pandemic. We're seeing hotel occupancy was down by 80% in May and 60% in July in Victoria. Passenger traffic on BC ferries was down 51% in the first 6 months of the year. And we're seeing passenger arrivals at the Victoria Airport down between 96% in May and 82% in July. So it looks like most people who are traveling in BC are from BC. They're traveling around BC, which is consistent with travel restrictions. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about what this looks like, because when Canadians travel in Canada, we spend differently than people from outside of Canada. So we actually spend less. We don't buy the same services. So a lot of tourism businesses, even though they're seeing demand from Canadians, it's not the same level as what they would see if we had our international visitors. The reality is that things are not going to improve for tourism businesses in any meaningful way until travel restrictions are eased. And borders are reopened, and even then, it may take some time for those for people to start traveling again. After SARS in 2003, it took about 3 years for travel to return to pre-SARS levels at places like Whistler that had big, that were very, had large international markets. Now, on a brighter note, the housing market has been relatively stable. There was an initial decline in activity in April and May when things were locked down, but starting in May and between May and August, there was a big increase in sales volumes and prices rose modestly. This may sound like a bit of a puzzle, but this goes back to who's been affected by the pandemic, and that's primarily those lower wage workers. In addition, we're seeing really low interest rates, which makes purchasing a property more attractive. So in summary, the outlook for Vancouver Island, like everywhere else, is quite uncertain. We know that the recovery is going to be uneven, with some sectors taking longer to recover than others. All indications are that the tech sector has performed well, and we're seeing film and television production start to resume, which is all positive. Continued population growth will support the housing market and some construction. And for other sectors, how the recovery unfolds is going to depend on a number of factors, including consumer behavior. We've seen a big shift in spending patterns. People are spending a lot more on groceries and less on entertainment and travel. We're all ordering online more, and we're becoming more comfortable with that. And this will change the retail market. We've seen a lot of retail businesses, big retailers, either close up shop or go into creditor protection. And as I mentioned earlier, the forced transition to remote working and the increasing use of virtual communications may change how people choose to live and also how business is conducted. And so we don't know at this point what the long-term trend in those areas is going to be and what that effect will be. And another final consideration is that we've just entered the second wave of the pandemic, and there may be additional restrictions imposed, which could slow things down again. And so we'll just have to wait and see how things unfold. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Susan. There was a lot of information there. You know, I couldn't help but think as you were going over that, it must be difficult to create a snapshot like this when you just mentioned the second wave. I mean, we have no idea how long this is going to last right now. I mean, we could be in this for years. So talk about the struggle there. I mean, trying to provide an update on the economy when, for all we know, we haven't even hit the worst of this.
It is definitely a challenge on what it is, and over the course of as things have unfolded, there's a lot of different data sources that have been looked at. So we're looking at a lot of unusual data sources. Like one of the things a lot of people have been using is bookings on OpenTable. Mm-hmm. Get a sense of what's happening in the restaurants, and so there's some data like that that's helping us to tell that. Is this? I guess I would think that at this point we're probably through the worst of it. We've in terms of the lockdowns, we're hoping we don't have to go into the restrictions again. Businesses did show that they could transition to remote working. And most businesses have managed to, in a lot of sectors, have managed to make that transition now. So a second wave of lockdowns won't have the same impact on them. The question is, what will it do to consumer confidence, and what would it do to, the prolonged downturn in the hospitality sector, and of course government budgets, because the longer governments provide these supports, that reduces the amount of money government has to spend on other things, and it also increases future debt obligations. So those are some of the considerations in putting this together. And I don't think anyone right now is willing to say what other than we're looking at ranges of downturns based on what we've seen and how long this is going to last. As I say, we're expecting a prolonged recovery, and that's going to be very different by sector.
When you say you think we're through the worst of it, do you mean from an economic standpoint in the sense that we have sort of learned how to operate in a pandemic? And so from that sense, we might be through the worst of it? Because, I mean, I want to push back a little bit. We don't know. We've been seeing case counts continue to rise. We very well not be through the worst of it. You know what I mean? Like this could any day. So I'm just trying to get a little understanding.
From an economic perspective, I think we're through the worst of it. We've hit the bottom.
Because we've seen what it can do, and okay.
Yeah.
I want to look back, and this is a bit of a blunt question, but you talked about 1981, the recession, the 2008 financial crisis. You mentioned the SARS in 2003. When you look at what we're going through right now with COVID-19, is this worse than those three pandemics or downturns?
Yes, this is worse.
And how much more? Significantly? Because some of those, you said SARS, 4 years to get through that. I think it was 6 years for the financial crisis when you talked about the forestry sector. Yeah. Are we looking at a decade rebound, longer?
I don't actually know. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that question. What we do know is we think that the bottom was hit in May, and there has been the recovery. The question is, how long does the recovery take to get us back to where we were? And that could be years. And for some sectors, it'll come back quicker. For other sectors, it's going to be a long time. And so it's not a one size or one story for all sectors. So it really depends on what happens in the next 6 months or so as we go through the winter, and do we go into those restrictions? Because if we go into additional restrictions, that's going to push us backwards again, and it's going to prolong whatever the recovery is. And there will be, and for some businesses, that will be the end of them for sure.
The positives you mentioned were the population growth and the housing market. Those are two positives here. But one thing that wasn't mentioned was the fact that on Vancouver Island, our case count has been low. And I think that's a bit of the island effect. We are an island, right? But that has been one of our greatest strengths, is the fact that we are on an island. And that in some cases that has worked against us in terms of, the cost of getting goods and services to the island. It can sometimes be looked as a negative. But I'm wondering if you looked into that at all. I mean, could the island's greatest strength, and one of the things that helps us get through this, is the fact that we are an island, we have a low case count, and we're seeing people who want to live here and in turn work here?
Absolutely, that could definitely be a strength, and that is a trend that we've heard anecdotally is happening, that people are moving outside the Lower Mainland. It's also possible that that's just continuation, as I had said, of the previous trends. So certainly that could be an appealing fact to have if the case counts on Vancouver Island stay low, which it looks like they have been through the pandemic. Most of it's been in Vancouver and the Fraser Valley. Now, one thing to keep in mind with that is that if we go back to restrictions, it may not be that we have restrictions. We may do something like they're doing in Ontario, where there's regional restrictions. So Vancouver Island would benefit from that, having a low case count, if there's regional restrictions as opposed to provincial-wide restrictions. So yes, it could. I would agree. It could be a very, very positive thing for Vancouver Island.
Let's talk about the service sector for a moment. One of the hardest hit industries. I know that some Chamber of Commerce's have said, 20 to 30% of businesses will not make it out of this. I've talked to restaurant owners here in downtown Victoria that have restaurants very close to those photos you provided in your presentation, who believe that it will be 50%. 50% of restaurants won't make it out of this. And I think there's a sense right now that a lot of businesses are holding on. They're taking out lines of credit, they're tapping into savings, and they're just trying to hold on and get through this, just praying that this ends soon and they've survived. Do you have any insight into if those numbers are correct? Or could we see 50% of downtown Victoria's businesses, or downtown Nanaimo, you name it? And I'm just curious what your numbers tell you.
As I said, we don't have numbers yet. Most of the numbers that are available in terms of businesses that are closing are coming from the surveys, such as the ones from the Chamber of Commerce. How that information is tracked is typically through business count data that Statistics Canada does a census twice a year, in December and June. on business counts. And that's where you would expect to start to see some of those trends. We have in June, we did see declines in business counts, but that was early on. The full extent of it, I don't think we're going to know for a while. And I wouldn't hazard to guess what the magnitude of that would be. There's, as I say, this is something we've never experienced before. So anything would just be a guess.
You mentioned stimulus packages. Back in 1981, some federal stimulus packages led to rising prices. It seems right now, though, especially for the tourism industry, we've heard calls for major financial help.
Mm-hmm.
From when we look at past pandemics, is there any takeaways that we can apply to the tourism industry right now? Things that need to happen that could help arguably the hardest hit industry on the island?
The experience from past, so the pandemics we've experienced in the past, the one in 1918 and 1919 with the Spanish flu, that's probably our best guide to what we're seeing right now. And what we saw then was that areas that had restrictions recovered faster. And that we also know that if you provide support, areas recover faster. In terms of what can you do for the tourism industry, the issue with the tourism industry right now is that their market is not, they don't have access to their market. And so it's not clear what the solution, it's honestly not clear what the solution to that is. There's certainly a need to pivot to serving the local market, but and as I said, the locals don't spend the same way that international visitors do. So you certainly need to pivot to your local market as an interim step, and then maybe a broader regional market. But I know that there's a lot of work being done right now by the government on looking into this. They've established the Tourism Task Force to come up with recommendations as part of the recovery strategy. So depending on the outcome of the election, we would expect to see that move forward. But is there a solution, a magic solution for the tourism industry at this point? I would argue probably not.
We just have a few more minutes, Susan, before we open it up to a Q&A. Last year, your message to the people at the summit, I believe it was essentially "Don't panic" was the message. Was that right? It was something along those lines.
Don't panic. It was "Don't panic."
What is your message to the people watching today? We have a lot of elected officials, leaders in the island business community. If it was "Don't panic" in 2019, what's the message in 2020?
What's the message in 2020? I would say, just remember, we're all in this together. We are all in this together, and we need to work together to get through this. And one of the ways I think we need to work together is we need to look at doing things. I think innovation. I would think innovation, to seek innovative ways to continue to operate and to live. Because the thing about this pandemic, it's not just, the effects are not just economic, they're broader than that. There's a lot of social impacts and mental health impacts that we need to keep in mind. So I think as Dr. Bonnie Henry says, be kind, and let's remember we're all in this together.
Susan, I appreciate your time this morning. For everyone watching, I want to let you know that we are going to move into a 15-minute Q&A segment. So if you have a question for Susan, and I'm sure many of you do, you can enter your questions through the Q&A option. There's a button on the bottom of your screen. Click that button, enter your question, and we will ask Susan everything you want to know. Susan, thank you for your time on the presentation. Reports like this are greatly needed, although they may be dire. I think it's important to get the facts out there so everyone knows exactly where we are. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you. As always, it was a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Susan, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and hopefully my audio is a little better for everyone watching. I know some people had trouble hearing my audio during that last portion of that presentation. I apologize. Hopefully the audio is fixed and better on this computer. Susan, we've got some questions coming in, so we'll get straight to them, if that works for you. All right, so we have a question here from Gerald, and two questions. We'll go with what advice for businesses to grow, but also prepare for the next recession. So what advice do you have for businesses, if any, to prepare for the next recession?
I think right now businesses need to focus on getting through the current situation. I think that one of the things, as I had said, is about looking for innovative ways to do things, and looking for learnings from other areas. So there are some sectors and some businesses that have been very successful in pivoting and figuring out how to do things in the current environment. And so it's a matter of learning from those who've been successful to do it. But there's also things like making sure your balance sheet is solid. And I'm not taking on, like, I wouldn't be opening a restaurant at this point. Even though I know that there have been some restaurants in my neighborhood that have opened, but I would not be taking on those kind of risks right now. So that would be the strategy. You'd be looking for that innovation and just being careful in managing your risk.
Question here from Nick Ward. Nick wants to know what this would look like without the government assistance and the stimulus. What if the tap, he says, has to be turned off at some point?
I think that if we hadn't had the government stimulus, this would be we would be looking at a situation that was worse than the 1930s at this point. The government stimulus has been key to supporting a lot of individuals as well as businesses, and helping them sort of get through that initial, and supporting the public health response. I don't think you would have had the compliance with the public health response that we saw unless you had the support for individuals and you had the support for businesses. So definitely the government stimulus has got us through this far. At this point, the government has plans to slowly pull back on the assistance that's coming to businesses and individuals, and that's been, the individuals has been transitioned. So we don't have the CERB anymore. We've gone into the EI system. So over time that will do. I don't think there would be a need at this point to suddenly turn off the taps, and I think that would be a mistake because it would push us backwards. But there is a need to sort of gradually adjust the level of stimulus as things start to recover.
We've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. They want to know, do you have any comparisons? You mentioned the Lower Mainland, and you said that the island was better off than many places in the Lower Mainland. Do you have any comparisons to elsewhere in the province? Or maybe, and I'll expand on this, maybe the rest of the country. Are your colleagues at MNP telling you what's happening on the other side of the country?
So what we're seeing in BC is that BC is, compared to other parts, we're doing better than some areas and worse than others. So the Maritimes is actually doing relatively well in terms of recovery compared to the rest of Canada. They've bounced back relatively well. They're still down, don't get me wrong, but it's all relative. Quebec and Ontario haven't, hasn't been great, so we're doing a little better than Quebec and Ontario. Alberta was already in a bit of an economic downturn before this, and this just has kind of piled onto it. For the prairie provinces, and like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, because of this, they're the least reliant on tourists, and a lot of what they're producing are global commodities like grain. So they have been some of the least affected areas by this, and in a lot of cases, they didn't have workplace closures and things like that. So BC's kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of recovery so far. And then in terms of within the province, the story that we saw with Vancouver Island, where employment levels have risen above where they were in February, is pretty consistent outside of the Lower Mainland. It's just the Lower Mainland is still, that still has that big hit below February levels. But it's important to understand that just because like February employment levels tend to be lower in the February anyways, like January, February, because of seasonality. So we're comparing it to something lower. If you look year over year compared to where we were the same month, it's actually employment is down across the province still.
Do you have any insight into the push to support local? We've got a question here from Michael, and he says, how important do you think supporting the local economy is? Is it making us more self-reliant? I mean, we've all seen this push to support our local businesses through this, but I think the second part of that question is a good one. You know, through this, do you think we'll come out the other end more self-reliant, you know, looking inwards as opposed to off the island?
That's a really good question. As I said at the end of the presentation, one of the things we don't know is how this is going to affect consumer behavior. So right now we're supporting local businesses. Once things, things open up and maybe we have access to all the things we did before, at least some of the things that we did before, will we continue to support those local businesses, or will we go back to the purchasing habits we had previously? And that's not clear right now. For local businesses, it's been really important to be able to shift to that digital delivery, and those that have done that, I think, have put themselves in a good position to be able to continue to serve their customers and be competitive once things ease and further down the road to recovery.
Keep your questions coming. We have a few more minutes here with Susan. Deb wants to know how we get a copy of the economic report. Everyone here today will get an email when this session ends, and that email will contain a link, and that link will take you to the report. I've got a question for you, Susan. We've chatted a couple of times now earlier today, and I have to apologize. I didn't say happy birthday earlier today. That's my bad. So happy birthday. I'm saying it now.
Thank you, Joe.
We've chatted a few times. You have made it quite clear that this is the worst economic downturn we've seen in decades. Yep. Correct?
Yes.
I know you're an economist, and your job, I believe, is to present the facts and let people interpret them. And so I know when I ask some of these questions, it's difficult for you because you're tasked with providing the numbers and the cold hard facts. But I have to think that there is a level of emotion that comes with this year's report. I mean, every year you provide the Island Economic Report, and this one, it is clear. This is the worst outlook we have seen in a very, very long time. And when you look at some of those sectors that you talk about, you say that the outlook is uncertain. And it isn't really uncertain. We know it's dire. You've made that clear. What's uncertain is just how dire it is. And so I'm curious, are you trying to not make it sound better than it actually is, but we do know that it's bad. It's not uncertain. I think you get what I'm saying. So walk us through how you present that and the toll that takes as an economist presenting the worst economic outlook we've seen in decades.
Okay. So when in looking at the numbers, it becomes very clear just how much there's a lot of variability in the data, even period to period. So when we're talking about uncertain, we're not just talking about the upside, we're also talking about the downside. So we don't actually know when we say uncertain. And so it's really there's too much uncertainty for us to really see what the clear path is out of this for many sectors. So it's bad. I think everybody acknowledges that it's bad, but there is a lot of uncertainty and a big range. Like we're seeing ranges in forecasts of GDP growth for next year between 2 and 5%. Typically in a forecast, you have a much narrower range. It'll be like 1.5 to 2.2 would be sort of what you'd expect. You wouldn't see this big 2 to 5%. The forecast decline in GDP for 2019 is between 2 and 8%. That's huge. Like I say, once again, they're usually you're able to come a lot closer, a lot narrower band. So there is a lot of uncertainty because things are changing and the influences are changing. And so as economists, we're really good at telling you what happened. In the past, we can look at some data and we can tell you what happened. We can tell you what happened in 1981. And we learn from those things and we don't make those same mistakes again. So we've changed how we conduct monetary policy and how we control inflation based on the lessons from 1981. In 2008, there was some changes that were made to the regulatory system, on the financial system. There's a lot of rules brought in to try to prevent that. So because we could see what it did and that. So we learn from history. And so when we're presented with a situation that is new and that doesn't match something that we've seen before, it's really difficult to tell how those things unfold because at the core of this is the decisions that individuals make. and how people respond. And people respond differently. And this one, as I had said, there's a big component to this that's a very social component, and how and there's some social disparity that's being exacerbated as a result of this. So how we come out of that is going to depend on how people react, and what moves forward with some of these supports, and whether we are able to provide some meaningful support to businesses like in the tourism sector to help them continue.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for answering that. A couple of more questions and then we'll let you go. Any sense, this is from another anonymous attendee, any sense of how island commercial real estate will fare and the timing of any lag in vacancies?
I really can't say much about the commercial real estate market on Vancouver Island. We would expect to see that there to be an increase in vacancies, especially in retail space, as businesses close. But beyond that, there's not really anything I can really say about it on it.
Okay.
So let me know.
Another question here. Many charities are reliant on sponsorships, grants, which typically come from foundations that rely on interest income. How will these sources be impacted or shifted in the near future?
Well, one of the things that we've seen is that the stock market has performed remarkably well. So if you have your investment income has been relatively stable. I mean, it did go down, but now it's come back up. So that's one of the anomalies we see in terms of the sources for other like foundations, and that we think that those will probably be decline as because people are donating less. They have lower levels of income, so there's less donation activity going on, and so there's going to need to, once again, here is to do a pivot, and there may be a need to change how they're doing their fundraising.
You mentioned the stock market. Do you think with so many residential real estate buyers being people who retired here, do you believe a significant drop in the stock market could slow the real estate market at all?
I don't think so, because many of those people have cashed out and they don't have mortgages. Many of the retirees they don't have mortgages, so they're selling another property and moving. So it's just really a transfer as opposed to there. And if you're moving from Vancouver, Victoria, or anywhere on the island is relatively affordable.
Right. There is another note here. I want to let everyone know that you can, and I'm not sure where it went. It might have been, oh, here it is. People can order a printed copy of this report as well if they want a hard copy, and that will get mailed to them. But again, if you're just joining us or just tuning in, you will get a link in your inbox after this session, and that will take you to an online version of this report. Susan, we've got a couple of minutes till 7, but it is your birthday, and it looks like the questions have slowed up. This is the last presentation of the summit, so maybe we'll let you go early to celebrate the birthday. But any final thoughts or comments that you want to get across today?
No, as I said, I think the key is to remember that we're all in this together, and to look for opportunities to innovate. And hopefully next year, when we get together for the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, we'll be able to tell a much better story, a much more positive story than what we have here.
When we get together in person, hopefully.
When we get together in person.
That's right. Susan, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. We should note that MNP is the sponsor of this presentation today, so thank you to them. There is a gift, Susan, in the mail. It'll be a belated birthday present from St. Jean's Cannery and Smokehouse for you. So thank you for being here, and have a great rest of your night.
Great, thank you.
All right. Again, everyone will get a link in their inbox with a copy of that report. You can order one, a hard copy that can be mailed to you. That is our Q&A portion of this talk and the last keynote presentation of this year's 2020 Summit. On behalf of Czech News, I want to say thank you for participating and being here. We're proud to be involved and proud to be sponsors. Before you go, though, one final word, and that comes from Dan Hurley, the principal of the Hurley Martin Group and the chair of the Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, to close out this year's summit. There he is, Dan, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and thank you to the Czech TV team for your ongoing support of the summit. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
And thank you, Susan, and your colleagues at MNP for once again sponsoring the economic report. It is so important for our island economy. So another State of the Island Economic Summit is now complete, but it is nothing like we have experienced before. What have we learned this week? That we must focus on our shared humanity as we embrace new technologies. We must showcase and invest in the entrepreneurs, tourism operators, and business owners that drive our island region economy. We must find creative ways to get our products to market and use progressive thinking to plan our communities. And we must continue to support our post-secondary institutions as they prepare our young people to face the challenges of tomorrow and to live and grow in our island region. We learned that everyone wins when Indigenous peoples thrive as full partners in economic prosperity. And we need to come together in a good way as one island region to make this change possible. The Vancouver Island Economic Alliance stands ready to do its part. We hope you all too. Now, as chair of VIEA's board of directors, it is my duty and pleasure to recognize those who helped to organize this 14th annual summit. Please join me in thanking our impressive team who have done such an outstanding job, and especially in this very challenging year. To all of the dedicated volunteers who served on our summit organizing committees, and especially our summit chair, Peter Van Duggen, to our talented moderators and presenters, to our generous sponsors and partners, to our amazing event staff and contractors, Selena Shao, Diana Jolie, Kelsey Wood, Susan Lewis, Wendy Sears, and finally, to VIEA's president and CEO, George Hansen. Thank you all for your tireless efforts to pivot this summit to the realities of living through a pandemic. I encourage you to express your appreciation through our social media channels using the hashtag VI Summit. As I conclude, I am pleased to announce that the 15th annual State of the Island Economic Summit will take place from October 26th to 28th, 2021. And it is our hope to be back in person at the Vancouver Island Conference Center in Nanaimo on Nanaimo territory. So until then, let us keep good company in the days and months ahead. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay connected. Marcy, thank you. Good evening.